Right, welcome everybody to the first webinar in the Agriculture and Food Forum series called Beyond the Bite. This is hosted by the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, ATSE, with the support of the Australian Academy of Science. This is a multi-part series exploring the future of Australian food and innovation from nutrition and sustainability to biosolutions, productivity and value-added innovation. My name is Richard Eckhardt. I'm a professor at the University of Melbourne, an ATSE fellow and a science leader in the Zero Net Emissions Agriculture CRC. But first and foremost, an acknowledgement of country. The Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands and waters across Australia upon which our fellows and staff work, live and apply science, technology and engineering. We recognise Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's ongoing connection to country, and we pay our respect to their elders past and present. We also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people's traditional knowledge, particularly in food systems, with the deep history of innovation embodies. And today I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people in Melbourne, of the Kulin Nation. So the event title today is Balancing Nutritional Value and Environmental Impact of Food. And so as a bit of a background, we strive to develop a global food security system that meets the needs of a growing world population. But we need to balance the varied nutritional needs of people with the environmental impact of the food we eat and the production of that food. Some frame this as a simple binary choice between plant-based foods and animal-based foods, but it's far more complex than that, as agricultural production systems and environmental pressures differ significantly. Just between, in a country as big as Australia, the north of Australia versus the southern Australia, the same food production can have vastly different impacts. And so we need solutions that operate at local and national level. This is the first webinar in ATSE's Food and Agriculture series, Beyond the Bite, and explores how we can balance the nutritional needs of a growing global population with the environmental impact of food production. Moving beyond a simple binary choice of plant versus animal, the discussion will unpack research, local data, practical solutions for building a healthier and more sustainable food systems. So today we've got two speakers who will talk for 15 minutes each, and we'll follow that with a question and answer session. You'll notice down the bottom of the screen in Zoom, there's a Q&A box. Please type your questions anytime in the Q&A box. Just as the presenters are going, you can type your question. Then you can also vote on your question. In other words, you can upregulate your question to the top of the queue by voting on it, or other people can vote on your question. And then towards the end of the presentation, I will look through the list and probably ask sequentially from the highest voted question down. Please don't type your question in the chat function. We're not using that for queuing up questions. Just in case, make sure your microphone is muted so that we don't hear any background noise. But I suspect the software does that automatically. So our two speakers today, both experts in food and environment. Dr. Brad Ridout from the CSIRO Agriculture and Food as Principal Scientist, who's an expert in life cycle assessment with a focus on sustainable food systems and sustainable diets. He's active in the innovation in LCA methods, some of which are adopted globally, and in the development of international standards, ISO standards, and other guidance documents for practitioners by FAO and the Life Cycle Initiative hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme. His research has created the main evidence base concerning the environmental impacts of dietary habits in Australia. So just a quick search of some of Brad's recent publications. They're words like diets within planetary boundaries, what's the potential of diet change alone, greenhouse gas emissions in the Australian diet. So Brad, we'll look forward to what you have to say there. The second speaker is Dr. Diane Mabry, also Principal Scientist with CSIRO Agriculture and Food. And Di is a systems scientist who provides science leadership to global, regional and farm scale analyses that will future-proof livestock production systems against a range of the challenges threatening their long-term viability. Her expertise contributes to science focused on overcoming the impacts of a changing and variable climate, diminishing resources, changing consumer demands, and pressures from consumers and government to decrease the impact of animal agriculture on the environment. DIA's research portfolio addresses these both in Australia and internationally with projects across the Asia Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we'll hand over to the first speaker, Brad, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen now, Brad. And then Di, if you can come straight in after Brad and share your screen and go straight into your presentation, and then we'll have the question and answer session. So over to you, Brad. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be with you. Nutrition and environment. Let's start by acknowledging that these are both very complex and challenging topics. There are, of course, many different foods, and diets are made up of multiple foods, and each food has its own nutritional profile. So there's a complication there, notwithstanding the fact that there are differences in nutritional requirements between men and women and over the life stage. And then when we look at the environment, there are many different environmental aspects. And for those environmental aspects, there are different environmental impacts that occur over different temporal and spatial scales. And then there's variation in opinion as to which is the most important or priority environmental aspects to be focusing upon. So they're both complicated and complex topics, which when we put them together, it becomes especially complicated. But from my perspective, the most sensible way of approaching it is through a total diet approach, because of the fact that diets are made up of multiple foods and dietary patterns can influence how frequently people eat and even the total dietary energy intake that occurs over the course of a day. And this total diet approach is what I'm going to be speaking about today. It's the approach we've been using for 10 going on 15 years here at CSIRO, and you'll see as we go through. Now, we have established quite a body of evidence over the last 10 to 15 years, and I'm only going to be able to touch on it here today in the 15 minutes I have available. But if you want more information, and especially looking for information about the methods and the results in detail from the studies that I'm talking about today, these two recent papers would be a good place to start. I've included this slide so that you can look them up if you're so interested. The first is a paper in the journal Dietetics, which is a PRISMA compliant systematic review of Australian evidence. So that would be a good place to start if you're interested in the topic. The second is a recent study looking at protein source, whether it's from plant or animal origin. Richard already mentioned that there's a lot of interest these days in plant-based diets. Well, there's a question about whether they are truly better for the environment and better for health. And so that's another study which would be worthwhile and recommended. But first things, it's important to have Australian evidence. Australian food production systems differ across the country and they're not necessarily well characterised and the same as global average food production systems or food production systems in Japan or Sweden or the UK or France or the USA or South America or wherever. We need Australian evidence that's based on Australian food production systems and taking into account the various environmental priorities as they appear in different parts of our own country. Take, for example, irrigation. Some parts of the country there is extensive use of irrigation, in other parts there's not. It's all dry land agriculture. And where irrigation is practiced, there's differences in water availability. All these things need to be taken into account at a local scale. And then there's the nutritional side. We need to be looking at Australian cultural dietary habits, and we need to be looking at those nutrients that tend to be widely underconsumed in the Australian food system. All these reasons point to the need to rely on Australian evidence rather than global studies or global modelling studies or studies based on global averages. The total dietary approach I already mentioned. Actual dietary intake data is very important, and you'll see that in a moment on one of my next slides. It's easy for anyone to sit in an ivory tower, let's say, and make up a theoretical diet or theoretical dietary scenarios. But what is the value of that if no one in Australia currently eats that way? Are we proposing that people are going to eat in a way that no one in the country eats currently? Or are we looking to shift diets towards those that are already represented in the Australian community that are more environmentally friendly and healthier? Relevant LCA indicators are also very important. We can't just add up water use as though the environmental relevance of water is the same wherever you use it, where a litre of rainwater is the same as a litre of water taken from a river or from an aquifer. And multiple environmental aspects. In the Australian food system, fruits are responsible for the largest proportion of pesticide toxicity footprint. Water footprint is mainly contributed by irrigated oilseeds, cereals, and fruits. Greenhouse gas emissions, a different picture again. So if we only look at one environmental aspect, we can get a very different result and conclusion compared with if we look at another. So it's important to look at multiple environmental aspects consistently. I mentioned already that I was going to speak particularly on this question of protein source, whether it's proteins coming from plant-based origin or animal-sourced origin. And the reason for this is because of the current high interest in plant-based diets. But there is evidence internationally that some sustainable diets and diets that are low in animal-sourced foods are lacking in key nutrients. By one estimate, a French study, they found that a minimum of around half of all protein should be from animal sources to achieve adequate intake of micronutrients. So what I'm going to be speaking today is presenting to you some results from studies that are based on the Australian dietary intake data. What we began with was nearly 10,000, or specifically 9,341 Australian adult diets sourced from the Australian Health Survey. And for each one of those diets, we applied a diet quality index, measuring the quality of the diet with respect to the Australian dietary guidelines, the current Australian dietary guidelines. Now, you may have questions about the dietary guidelines and whether they are what they should be, but I'm not going to talk about that today. We're using the Australian dietary guidelines as an independent point of reference. So each one of these nearly 10,000 diets was scored in terms of how, to the extent to which they conform with the current Australian dietary guidelines. And for each one of those diets, we also calculated an environmental impact score based on 4 LCA-based or life cycle assessment-based indicators. Those 4 indicators were individually calculated and then aggregated using a weighting model that was based on distance to planetary boundaries. After doing that, we stratified the population because we didn't want a sample that was based entirely on 20-year-old young men or 70-year-old old ladies or whatever. So we stratified the sample and then constructed a quadrant analysis. So we pulled out a quadrant that was those diets, those Australian diets, which were lower in environmental impact and higher in diet quality. We're interested in these diets because they represent the best practice in terms of dietary intake we have in Australia presently. Those diets which are present in the community and are widely consumed by, well, a quarter of the population, and they are already more compliant with dietary guidelines and lower in environmental impact. We think it's feasible that if we could get the other 75% of Australians to eat a little bit more like this group of people, then we could achieve quite a lot. And this high quality, low environmental impact subgroup had a diet quality score which was 37% higher than the Australian average adult diet, and the environmental impact score was 38% lower. So the improvements are not just marginal, they are quite substantial. And you might ask, well, what was so different about those diets? The main difference between those diets which fell into our high diet quality, low environmental impact subgroup was that they contained far fewer discretionary foods. If you're not familiar with the Australian dietary guidelines, they talk about the main food groups. fruits and vegetables, dairy products, and of dairy alternatives and so forth. And then there's this other group, which is called discretionary foods. It includes pies and biscuits and donuts and cakes and dairy desserts and soft drinks and these types of things. Foods which are nutrient poor but energy dense. And the Australian Dietary Guidelines recommends that they should be consumed occasionally and in small amounts. A big problem in the Australian context is that these discretionary foods, and they're called discretionary because we don't really need them in our diet at all, but they are common, is that they are consumed in large quantities and frequently. And these Australian diets, which fell into our desirable quadrant, included around 2 serves of discretionary foods per day, compared to the average Australian diet, which had over 7 serves of these foods per day. Also, our preferable diets also contained about 23% higher intake of vegetables. On terms of other types of foods, there wasn't a great deal of difference. But what you can see here is that the total energy intake for our high quality, low environmental impact subgroup was about 30% lower. And this is what I mean when people like to compare hypothetical or theoretical dietary scenarios. They almost always do so by comparing diets on an isocaloric basis. But they're missing the major point here in that healthier and more sustainable diets include less dietary energy intake in the first place because they're not eating all of these junk foods which tend to lead to overconsumption of dietary intake in the first place. And all environmental impacts are positively correlated with total dietary intake in the first place. We looked deeper into this quadrant of diets by proportion of protein, which was from animal sources. And you can see there in the first column, those diets which were less than 20% animal protein, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, 60 to 80, and 80% and above animal protein. And you can see that currently our more sustainable and healthier diets, the most common proportion of animal source protein was 60 to 80%. Another thing to notice there is that as proportion of animal source protein increased, so too did total protein intake. It seems to be that when people restrict their sources of protein, they tend to eat less protein overall, which is not necessarily a good thing, particularly when higher protein intake was also correlated with lower total dietary energy intake, which is a positive thing because most Australians are consuming more total dietary energy than they require. For this group of adults, the Australian Dietary Guidelines recommend a minimum intake of meats and alternative from the meats and alternative food group of 2.5 serves. We find that those diets with less than 60 to 80% protein did not eat enough servings from this meat and alternatives food group. It's called a meat and alternatives food group because it contains protein-rich foods such as eggs and tofu and legumes that are not meat, but they are considered to contribute as protein-rich foods. Also, we looked at the degree to which these diets met the estimated average nutrient requirements published by the NHMRC's nutrient reference values for all of those nutrients for which there is an estimated average requirement. Some nutrients, the required intake is so uncertain that there's no EAR. But what you can see here is that listed at the top are those nutrients like vitamin B3. Pretty much all of the diets achieve adequate intake of vitamin B3, and this is an important point. There's some nutrients which it doesn't really tend to matter how people eat, what their dietary pattern is. They seem to get enough of that nutrient because it's widely prevalent in the food system and across different types of foods. But there are many other nutrients listed towards the bottom of the table where inadequate nutrient intake relative to EAR is widely lower. But what you can see here in the red box is that those diets which had 60 to 80% of their protein coming from animal source foods, they had the highest overall achievement of EARs. So I think my time is just about wrapping up. I conclude by saying sustainable diets in the Australian context have the highest micronutrient adequacy when they obtain 60 to 80% of protein from animal sources. On the contrary, those diets which had the least animal source protein had the highest incidence of underachievement of nutrient intake. And I'll skip to the bottom statement there, is that sustainable healthy diets in Australia, there is still a risk of an inadequate intake of calcium, zinc, magnesium, and vitamins A and vitamin B6. So the big take-home message here is that the discretionary foods are a big part of the story, the main part of the story, whenever we're talking about sustainable healthy diets. And secondly, those foods which are rich in bioavailable sources of those nutrients, such as calcium, zinc, magnesium, vitamins A, and vitamins B6, which tend to be widely underconsumed across the Australian community, foods that are rich in bioavailable sources of those nutrients need to be given first priority in any formulation of a sustainable healthy diet. And I'll leave it there because I think my 15 minutes has expired. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. Just gonna share my screen. Okay, hopefully we can all see that. Yeah, so thanks, Brad and Richard, and to the Academy for the invitation to speak today. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the Turrbal, Yugara, and Jagera people as the traditional owners of the land from which I'm joining today. Brad has talked about some of the nutritional considerations of sustainable diets, while I'll be focusing more on how we convey information about the environmental impacts of food production, and hopefully get you to think a little bit more about what different indicators and metrics of environmental impact actually mean. Simply categorizing foods as good or bad, or sustainable or unsustainable doesn't do justice to the complexity and diversity of our food systems. So what I aim to convince you of this afternoon is that it's where and how food is produced that's critically important, as is consideration of which environmental outcomes are actually relevant for a specific region or production system. As Rich mentioned, I'm a livestock scientist, so most of my examples are going to be animal-based, but the arguments could also apply to other food commodities. So food systems are linked to both human and planetary health, as well as contributing to human nutrition, health, food security, livelihoods, and societal well-being. Food systems are also associated with environmental impacts. A large proportion of these impacts occur on farm in production systems. And so today I'm going to focus on agricultural production rather than the other parts of the food system, though acknowledging that they're all very important. The first point I want to make today is that what we measure and how we report it matters. When we discuss environmental sustainability, we often collapse very different issues into a single conversation. But environmental impact, and therefore the sustainability of food systems and diets, includes multiple dimensions. And some of the most commonly assessed domains that we talk about are climate change, and this includes greenhouse gases, land use, water scarcity, nutrient pollution, and loss of biodiversity. And these issues and their indicators are not interchangeable. A food that performs well against one indicator might perform poorly against another. So, for example, nuts have a fairly low greenhouse gas emissions footprint per kilo of protein produced, but they've got very high land and water use requirements. So we need to take a systems perspective and consider more than just a single issue when we're comparing foods or thinking about our choices. It also matters what metrics we use to express these impacts. So using emissions as an example, what denominator do we use? Do we care about emissions per kilo of food produced, or is it per kilo of energy or protein, like some of Brad's examples? Or maybe it's area of arable land that's used. Looking at the volume of product can be useful when we're comparing between farms producing the same product under similar conditions, because it helps to, I guess, articulate some of the efficiencies or differences between different management systems. But if we're comparing between commodities, like between wheat and lentils or wheat and beef, it's probably better to consider using nutritional units or land area as a denominator. And of course, when we're considering sustainable diets, there's a clear role for metrics which consider nutritional outcomes. And what about the spatial and the temporal boundaries of production systems? So here's another livestock example. Chickens have a fairly short production cycle of just a few months, while cattle live for a couple of years. So are we interested in the impact of an industry or farm per year, or over the life cycle of the product, which might be much less or much greater than a year? And are we interested in just on-farm Scope 1 emissions, or those associated with all of the inputs that go into production? So in Australia, most cattle spend most of their lives grazing pastures, and there's relatively low inputs of supplementary feed or other inputs. So for beef in Australia, most emissions and other environmental impacts occur on farm, and they're Scope 1 emissions. So this includes enteric fermentation and impacts that are associated with the land use or land use change. In comparison, poultry production is often quite intensive, and a large proportion of their emissions and other impacts occur off-farm in the production of food or feed in croplands, and that has high levels of inputs in terms of fertiliser. So whether or not we include Scope 3 emissions will make a big difference to how sustainable chicken meat appears. How a type of food is produced is also important. And again, the choice of indicator or metric can influence your perspective. So I'm often asked if grass-fed or grain-finished beef is better for the environment. And it depends. In Australia, most beef cattle spend most of their lives grazing, and then some of them will spend a couple of months at the end of their life in a feedlot. And they're fed high energy and high protein diets to help them grow faster and more efficiently. So one of the biggest criticisms of beef production is the high amount of greenhouse gases produced, particularly enteric methane. And intensive feedlot systems are much more efficient than grazing systems. So these results are from a paper that my colleague Dean Thomas did, comparing enteric methane emissions from the two systems. And you can see that even by spending a short period of time in a feedlot eating grain, can reduce average methane emissions by around 20%, and then methane intensity, which is presented here, by closer to 30%. But the other argument you often hear about livestock systems is that they're competing with humans for food, and that it would be more efficient to feed grain directly to people rather than having this intermediate step of feeding livestock and then eating the livestock. But the great thing about ruminants is their ability to upcycle non-human edible products into meat or milk. So to demonstrate this, Dean calculated the net protein contribution for both systems. And this is the ratio of human edible protein in beef to human edible protein in what the cattle are eating. So the grass and any other supplementary feeds that they're getting and what they're fed in a feedlot. And so with net protein contribution, any value over 1 shows a net benefit. So both of these systems created protein, which is great, but the grass-fed beef produced more than 800 times more protein than the grain-finished beef. So which of these two metrics is more important in deciding which system has the lowest environmental impacts? Are you going to choose the grain-finished beef on the basis of emissions, or the grass-fed beef based on resource use? Would your decision change if I also gave you information about biodiversity impacts or water use, if I had those? Or are you going to choose grass-fed regardless because you like the picture of the cows grazing in their lush green pasture under the trees, and you like the idea of animals being raised in a natural environment? Or maybe you're thinking more about cost of living and you're going to choose whatever option is cheapest, and that might be the chicken. So the final thing I want to say about types of environmental impact indicators is just to highlight the difference between pressure and impact indicators. So I've talked a lot so far about pressure indicators that convey the amount of inputs or environmental load, like how much land area is used or how much water is used, how much fertilizer is applied to produce a unit of food. But those metrics don't tell you, those indicators don't tell you if that's good or bad, or what the actual impacts on the environment are. So in comparison, impact indicators, and Brad showed some of these, they're harder to quantify, but they give a better indication of the consequences of that load. So instead of only how much land or water is used, these indicators consider how much water is available, what's the quality of water, where did it come from, what else could it be used for, whether that's food production or other human uses. So leaning into the water example, water in a high rainfall system is not environmentally equivalent to using the same amount of water in a water constrained basin or a low rainfall area. A kilo of rice on average takes around 1,600 litres of water to produce. Using this volume of water might matter more in the Murray-Darling Basin, where water is tightly controlled and contested, compared to the Ord River or the Ord irrigation system, where water is more abundant. And growing a kilo of rice in Italy or Indonesia will differ again. Building on this, I want to spend a bit of time talking about using indicators that are meaningful at local scales and reflect what environmental issues are actually important. There are a huge number of papers in high impact journals that compare environmental impacts of different foods and across different countries. And while these global assessments are really great for drawing attention to the environmental impact of food and food systems, they can oversimplify the complex, diverse, and dynamic agricultural systems where food is produced. So environmental impacts depend heavily on geography, the production systems, and local resource constraints. And as we've already seen, the same food product can have different impacts depending on how and where it's produced. So what environmental issues and indicators should we be focusing on for Australia? So Australia is a useful case study. As Brad and Rich mentioned, our agricultural systems are very diverse and they're different to those found in Europe and North America. In Australia, livestock production is the biggest land use, and most livestock are raised in extensive or very extensive systems based on native vegetation. And this includes tropical savannas and woodlands. You can see this picture here is from Katherine in the Northern Territory, and then shrublands and grasslands. And this is a picture from out in Winton in Western Queensland. So soil and rainfall constraints mean that most of this land is not suitable for growing other food, for cropping or for horticulture, and livestock remain the only large-scale option for food production. So mostly cattle, but also sheep and goats. They graze on unimproved native pastures with minimal inputs. So productivity is quite low compared to more intensive systems in southern Australia and other countries. Livestock densities and stocking rates in Northern Australia, 10 hectares per cow would not be uncommon, whereas in Southern Australia, we talk about cows per hectare. If I was thinking about some of these global analyses and the indicators they're looking at for environmental sustainability, meat produced in these systems would be assessed as having a high environmental load simply due to land use. However, if the landscape is still in a fairly natural state, and that's not universal, but in a lot of cases it is, so it's in a natural state, it can't be used for alternative food production systems, does it really matter that we're using so much land to produce beef? The extensive and the low input nature of this production means that nutrient pollution is probably actually low, and so the large land use might actually be a good thing. But the main environmental issues for this region that we should be focusing on include methane emissions from livestock, issues relating to landscape degradation from clearing or overgrazing, which leads to changes in biodiversity, these things instead. So that's what we should be focusing on, not just a simple pressure indicator of how much land is being used. The next largest area of agriculture is the mixed crop and livestock systems in southern Australia, and they're shown here in the dark and the light green on the map. So most crops and around 40% of livestock are produced in these areas, and the majority are dryland systems based on rainfall rather than irrigation. These production systems are more intensive than the extensive grazing systems, and so they face some additional environmental challenges. So, for example, replacement of deep-rooted perennial native vegetation with annual shallow-rooted crops has contributed to salinity of soils and waters, and fertiliser use has contributed to soil acidification. Using the right data, local data, to calculate sustainability metrics is also important. So sustainability is a global problem, and as we've mentioned, these global analyses get a lot of press. So this figure here is from the State of Food and Agriculture report that the FAO released in 2024. And the report uses global data sets like FAO Stat to compare production systems across different countries. Now, FAOStat is great if you want an easy, quick, consistent comparison across different countries, but it doesn't take into account how we actually produce our food. So in this example, the emissions from agriculture from the FAO Tier 1 method were 30% higher than the number for the same year that our national inventory calculated. And this is just due to the local applicability of the methods and the data that our national inventory use, while the FAO is more of a back of the envelope approach. So to conclude, consideration of multiple indicators gives a broader, more holistic perspective of the environmental impacts of food production. And I know a lot of my examples have focused on greenhouse gas emissions, and that's mostly because that's where a lot of my work is focused. But I've also hopefully shown that we need to be thinking about other issues as well. It can't just be about greenhouse gas emissions all the time. I've also hopefully shown that environmental impacts are highly dependent on how and where food is produced. Thinking about only meat versus grains or good or bad doesn't capture the whole picture or the diversity of systems. So to address this, we need to consider what environmental issues are relevant to different regions and production systems, and to focus on monitoring and reporting these using appropriate indicators and metrics. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Brad and Di. Fascinating presentations there, things we need to consider. There's a few questions coming in, and some that Brad and Di, you might want to reply to just by typing, just particularly the two anonymous ones if you want to. But I think there's a question by Simon that ties up with a question I had for you. Are we looking at a future where there are trade-offs? In other words, the future consumer being more informed about the various ESG impacts, because Di, you presented a story that Northern Australia, it might be biodiversity that's more valuable than methane, and Southern Australia, it might be the opposite, or it might be water in some areas of Australia. How do we get to a future where we have that discretion to trade off between various ESG criteria? I'll let you both have a go at the answer if you want.
Brad, did you want to go first, or do you want?
Oh, well, to begin with, you have to have data on those different dimensions, and then the trade-offs are largely value judgments. They're questions that go beyond science. Different people may give higher weight to the environment versus human health. Other people may think, well, human health is less important than the environment. I mean, and it becomes a value choice, a question that is beyond science.
Thanks, Brad. Di?
Yep. And to add to that, I think people's values have different scales. So something like biodiversity is very locally applicable, whereas if we increase or decrease greenhouse gas emissions, that has a global impact. And in Australia, we actually export a lot of our agricultural commodities, particularly red meat and some grains. So if we were only going to focus on Australian greenhouse gas emissions, and we decided that one way to do that was to decrease beef production so that we weren't exporting to other countries. We were only feeding Australian people. People in Indonesia and other countries are still going to want to eat beef. So they'll get it from somewhere else, and it might be a less efficient production system. And so nationally, our emissions will go down. And so we can feel happy about that. But globally, emissions might go up. So I think there's a lot of personal perspectives in this, but also people thinking about different scales of the different impacts.
So you both touched on the various metrics, and one of the problems we've got with, say, greenhouse gas emissions is the value chain usually use a mass-based metric to say it's the mass of grain rather, and dairy is probably the most differentiated where they do it on a fat and protein basis. But Brad, you presented table 5 that shows there's a significant nutrient density comparison that's missing there. Do we need another type of metric that is more representative of the nutritional value or the the multiple criteria in the field? How do we get to a point where there's a more meaningful metric than just a mass of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram live weight?
Well, there is a movement within LCA called nutritional LCA, where it's practiced in different ways, but the aspiration is to incorporate nutritional qualities of food products into the LCA. And personally, I'm quite a critic of it because the most sensible way of approaching the problem is to look at the complete diet or the total diet, which is what I tried to emphasize in my talk today. If you look at the whole diet, you realise that certain nutrients are widely available in the Australian food system and most people obtain enough of them, whereas other nutrients tend to be underconsumed by a wide proportion of the population. And we only see that when we look at the total diet, not when we look at individual foods. And you have to put the food into the context of the total diet. And this movement towards a nutritional unit of analysis in LCA, it's commonly practiced in dairy, fat and protein corrected milk, and it makes sense there.
Sure.
But it doesn't make sense in a lot of other cases, and it really just becomes a cherry picking exercise as to what your food product is characterized by. Your industries can pick their favorite nutrient that makes their product look beneficial without taking into account the wider dietary context. So I actually see nutritional LCA as being having few advantages and a great many risks.
Thanks, Brad. Di, anything to add?
No, I think Brad's done a fairly thorough job of tackling that one.
Okay, well, we'll go to Paul's question here. Some groups claim you just need vitamin supplements for a plant-based diet. Is that correct? I think that
Well,
right at you, Brad.
well, I'm not sure if the question's being asked in all seriousness, but if you take that approach where you just need to give everyone a vitamin tablet, it really means you're giving up on the food system. Of course, it's preferable to obtain your nutrition through food. A lot of nutrients by supplements are they're not necessarily the equivalent forms of the vitamin or nutrient. They may be very poorly absorbed into the body. and the net bioavailability may be a very small proportion of what is in the supplement. What we're gaining an increased appreciation of is the food matrix, and that nutrients occur not as floating substances within foods, but embedded within the food matrix, and there's an actual wonder and benefit from consuming nutrients in the whole food context.
Great. There's another question here. Could it be that this is just education? In other words, the difference between plant and animal protein is a lot of people don't realize just eating plants is not equivalent to eating enough protein. Is that just consumer education about adequate diets?
Unfortunately, there's a lot of information. It tends to be very incomplete information, and usually information that's disseminated because there's some vested interest associated with it. I mean, people in the livestock industries like to emphasize that the protein from eggs and from meat and dairy is a complete protein, including all of the essential amino acids. But it's possible to obtain all the essential amino acids from a variety of different plant-based foods. The point I would make, and I maybe didn't make it strong enough in my presentation, is that most Australian adults obtain enough protein. That, in other words, what I'm saying is they obtain adequate protein relative to the estimated average requirement. Now, whether it's beneficial to eat more protein, that's probably wise as well, but that's another issue. A lot of diets are based on higher protein-based diets because protein fills you up and it keeps you full for longer. But the point about whether your protein-rich foods are coming from plant or animal origin often focuses on the micronutrients. So when we eat protein-rich animal source foods, we're also obtaining a lot of those micronutrients that tend to be widely underconsumed in the Australian food system. So eating plant-based, animal-based protein foods are important not just as a source of protein, but perhaps even more important as a source of underconsumed micronutrients. So yeah, that's how I would answer that question.
I'm going to ask a more controversial one here about, the source of funding, because, there's the obvious question, if we're all funded by the Meat and Livestock Association, Meat and Livestock Australia, whose benefit was the research project designed to serve? Now, before you answer, this is something that comes back to our own research integrity. So take it as it's put, but do you have an answer for that?
Sure. I mean, I work at the CSIRO, and our mandate is to work with industry to undertake research projects. But at least I can say in my case, I've worked with a variety of different industries. And what I would say is that conflicts of interest have always been very, very carefully managed, where the decision to publish the research was made prior to contracting. So the results would be published irrespective of what the research found, what the conclusions were, and the funding body had no part whatsoever in the research design or in the interpretation of results or writing of the paper. And you'll see that in any paper you drill down to that on this topic that I have written, that is very clearly disclosed in the aftermath of those papers.
Fair. Di, did you have a comment there?
Yeah, I mean, like Brad, I do receive funding from Meat and Livestock Australia. I do also receive funding from other industries, so Grains in Australia and non-industry specific funding. I think one of the things about receiving, I guess, I receive funding from the livestock industry because I'm doing work on livestock, and there aren't many other agencies around or that are going to fund work on livestock. And because I work in livestock, I understand livestock systems in a reasonable amount of detail. So it does put me in a reasonable position to comment and to investigate livestock systems. But as Brad said, we both work for the CSIRO. We both, scientific integrity is important to what we do. And just because a lot of what I do is in livestock doesn't mean that I'm always trying to find the right answer for them.
Yeah, always a tricky question because it comes back to research integrity, and that's one thing that's held pretty high. Now I'm going to try and combine two questions here, and it goes to a previous question I put forward. How do we get the general public to understand, choose the best options when everything is so interconnected? It's kind of, I touched on this earlier, but I'll combine it with Nigel's question here. Would a total nutrient index, sorry, I've got dogs in the room. Would a total nutrient index be something we should consider? Now, there's a vested interest here. About 15 years ago, I published a paper on a total nutrient index as a means of greenhouse gas assessment between foods, and no one's ever cited the paper or quoted the paper. But there's a question here. How do we simplify this? Or how do we, are there a total nutrient food index metric, as you said, that Brad can simplify this for people?
There are nutrient profiling algorithms that there's dozens of them, and people tend to use the one that they've heard other people have used, or one which they like, which is a researcher's modeling choice. The point is that no food contains all of the required nutrients, and so we need a variety of nutrients. So expressing or qualifying one food in terms of its nutrient density is in a sense a meaningless exercise, because we need a variety of foods in our diet, and different foods provide different nutrients. I mean, if you're applying it in a very narrow sense, such as fat and protein corrected milk, of course, fat and protein varies from different farms, and over the course of the season, it varies as well. It provides a way of making a normalized comparison, but applying it in the sense towards nutrition, as I say, we need more than one food to make up a diet, and trying to say one food is more nutritious than another, as if you just found the most nutritious food and ate it and nothing else, all your problems would be solved. It's a futile pathway to go down, and is actually unscientific and impractical. What we need to focus is on the characteristics of complete diets, and that is the way I recommend the focus should go.
Okay, Don, something to add?
I guess you could take a similar approach to considering environmental impacts. So in some ways, yeah, maybe it would be nice if we just had like one indicator that summed up all of the environmental impacts, and it was a sticker on our products in the supermarket. But a lot of people, they don't understand what goes into that. There'd be concerns about greenwashing, and people, as Brad mentioned earlier, they have different priorities. And the details of the ingredients that went into that product at the supermarket, or if the capsicums came from the Lockyer Valley or from somewhere in New South Wales, the environmental impacts are always going to be changing, and where food products come from is always changing. So I don't think oversimplifying things is the right way to go. I think helping people understand the complexity of how and where food is produced has heaps of benefits.
The other thing I could add, Richard, is that a popular nutrient profiling algorithm is the nutrient-rich food, or NRF 9.3. It includes 9 nutrients that are considered beneficial and 3 nutrients to avoid. Even that is based on completely outdated scientific evidence, because in the Australian situation, the upper limit for salt was removed because there's not insufficient scientific evidence to quantify an upper limit for salt intake. In fact, most people who eat a healthy whole food diet probably require more salt. The only people who are having excessive quantities of salt are people who eat a lot of processed foods, because processed foods are laden with salt.
Yeah.
Also, these indices are often biased against saturated fat, which is shown to be, those models and theories were wrong. The latest meta-analyses of showing that saturated foods incorporated into whole foods like full-fat dairy are not associated with disease outcomes, whereas once they were seen as being something that is problematic and should be avoided. So I think these indices they may seem attractive, but they have probably more downsides than they have upsides in actual fact.
Yeah, I'm going to ask another question from an ex-student of mine, actually, Paul Mwangi, who comes to us from Guelph in Canada, of all places. Paul asked, have you done work on the environmental impact of alternative meat and dairy products? In other words, does the consumer have a valid choice there, an informed choice, because we understand the full LCA of the alternatives to conventional animal-based protein? I don't know, either Brad or Di.
Largely not, because we have statistics on agricultural production and they're well characterized. When it gets into the food processing steps, a lot of that information is not publicly available. And the production of plant-based meat alternatives are normally proprietary products, and there's little known about those products in terms of their environmental performance, except which may be selectively published in LCA studies. Now, my understanding is that most soybean isolate and concentrate based plant-based mince and burgers and sausages and so forth have a carbon footprint, if measured using the GWP 100, something similar to chicken. So it's not as though these plant-based alternatives are without their own environmental impacts that can be as large as meat products in the first place.
Great. Just a quick question from Karen. How was the environmental impact SOAR calculated, and was this Australian LCA data? I suspect that's you, Brad.
Yes, it's based on Australian specific data. So, for example, when we calculate the water footprint of all different products, we base it on a map of agricultural production where that's happening in the country, where those areas that include irrigation and what the irrigation is relative to the yields, where it was basically the foods are going through food processing steps. Best available data was obtained for the water use in those food processing factories, and also the geographic distribution of where the factories are in those different industries and so forth. So we arrive at Australian specific estimates of the water footprint of generic food products. They're not at the level of branded food products, because to do so, you would only be able to do those calculations with support from each food processor, because you wouldn't know what is the environment resource use in those factories. Same with greenhouse gas emissions, and same with pesticide toxicity footprint. We base it on a map of pesticide use across different farms, different types of farms in different parts of the country, and go from there and building up a Australian specific data set.
Great. Di, a question for you. What should be the priority for methane accounting or methane assessment? Is a model adequate, or should we be expecting direct measurement out in the field?
Thanks, Rich. So direct measurements for enteric methane, anything that's very accurate tends to be an individual animal measurement. So something like a respiration chamber, where we put a sheep or a cow inside a chamber and we can measure how much methane is produced over a period of time. We've also got some individual animal measurement tools that are suitable for animals in a paddock, but they're very expensive for any level of accuracy. So they're really suitable only as research tools in helping us to I guess, develop or test or evaluate, validate different technologies for reducing enteric methane. At the national scale, we know that enteric methane is the biggest source of emissions from the livestock sector. And we have very robust equations that are Australian specific around estimating enteric methane from beef cattle in particular. And again, that's where most of our enteric methane comes from. The bit where we struggle a bit is the activity data that the National Inventory use. So we calculate enteric methane based on how many animals there are and how much they eat. How much they eat is based on how big they are and what feed is available. So bigger animals eat more, they produce more methane. Getting that data is hard. Getting data on the accurate data on the number of animals we have and where they are and how big they are, that's also hard. So I'd say at the national level, modelling is more appropriate than direct measurement, but we could, having more accurate activity data would be useful.
Great, and yeah, it's interesting to look at the data on that, and that the coefficient of variation of measuring methane from animals in the field is probably higher than the variation in the calculated emissions from those animals. So the uncertainty in the calculation is about the same as the uncertainty in measurement if you're not under controlled chamber conditions. So it becomes an esoteric argument, doesn't it?
Yep.
Great. So to keep on time, it's now 1:03, and we have got to the end of, well, we haven't actually got through all the questions, but sorry about the two that remain. But thanks to Brad and Di for your insightful presentation. I think a good presentation raises more questions than answers, and that's what you've done. You've raised a lot of questions with us about where we should be going in the future. So thank you very much for your presentation. And to everyone attending, please note this is a first in a series of the Agriculture and Food Forum Beyond the Bite webinars. So there will be more coming up. Please keep a lookout for them. They're hosted by the ATSI and the Australian Academy of Science in support. So thanks everyone. Thanks Brad and Di, and thanks to ATSI for hosting this first webinar. Thanks everyone.